Hey everybody, and welcome back to the MVC tutorial. I'm Kevin, and we're ready to attack our destroy method on this flight controller and wrap up some of these custom features that we've been building out. And one of the nice things, again, about having a custom table is we have full control over how our data is saved and manipulated as we move through the system. And so what we want to look at in this video is not only how to destroy record within the database, but also how to protect ourselves against non-authorized users from taking certain actions, and then also just to enhance the security of our overall flight model. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to take this flight, and really we just have to have delete in here. And whenever this delete method is hit through a delete method on a request, so we'll send a request to a delete page, and that delete page will have the method of not get, not post, not put, but it will have the method of delete, and then it will delete this record. Okay, and then so that's what we're going to do here. We're just going to delete that record, and I want to jump over to the tutorial so I can kind of show you some of this code. It's a little bit different than what we're used to here. Okay, so let's go to our tutorial and scroll into this destroy section. Now, we're used to sending a redirect, but this time we're sending a response. And we're also checking to see if the user is authorized to take a certain action. And we're doing this in the delete section because that's the most destructive part of the application. Edit's pretty destructive as well, but deleting, it's just gone forever. There's not even a sign of the record at all. And so before we do this kind of delete stuff, we want to make sure we're protected. And we also want to send back a response with sort of this warning method or warning information. So let's do that first. So let's return the response. And so we're going to pull in the response here. And this is the actual application response. So this is the full response for the page, including like the status and all of that kind of information. So we're going to do a warning here, and we'll say flight deleted. And when we return the response directly, what that means to us is TypeRocket's going to send back a JSON response for us. And like we had said earlier, AJAX is one of the only ways to send an actual true HTTP delete method request. Now, we can spoof it with HTML forms by having that spoof underscore method have delete in it. However, if we want to hit this directly without having to have an HTML form, we can use AJAX. And that's exactly how our admin works here on the flights page. If we hit this delete button, it's going to send an AJAX request, and we'll take a look at that from this network tab here. Let's kind of make it this form. XHR requests, and then we're going to hit delete here. And are we sure we want to delete? Well, actually, no, we don't. Let's delete one of these older ones here, or fresher ones. I want to keep ID of 1. So we're going to hit delete confirm, and then we'll see flight deleted. And then if we go in here, we'll see that our method was sent as a post request. And scroll down, the method spoof was delete. And then our response was this JSON response. So that's what happens whenever you send a TypeRocket response object. It's actually going to grab a response object for you and send it on over. And then you can use that with the TypeRocket HTTP system to do things like that flash message that we saw. And that's how the delete works. And it automatically removed it from the row here without really having to refresh the page. So that's setting up our delete section. However, we do want to add a little bit more protection here. So I'm going to grab this bit of code and copy it and paste it into here. And now our flight is going to basically say, hey, if you're not allowed to delete things, then we're going to tell you you're unauthorized. And we haven't set up what are called policies. And this can method essentially looks on the model, and it tries to find a model that matches the policy. And we can find policies under auth here. Let's say a post policy. Is the user capable of editing posts? Is the user capable of editing posts? Then we'll allow destruction. Okay, so essentially for this flights, we're asking, hey, can you delete or not? And otherwise, you're not authorized to do that. So let's go back here and let's try deleting a record. Okay, you're not authorized to delete flight. So how do we set up a policy for our flight here so we can be protected like we are with this post policy? Now, by default, if there's nothing defined and you don't have a policy, it's always going to be false. So like we created our models, we can also create policies. So let's go in here and look at Galaxy, and we'll see make policy is here. So PHP Galaxy, make policy. And we'll see we need to give the policy a name. So I'll give it flight as the name. And then we have a flight policy created. And if I go over here, we'll see that I have the flight policy. And it's just called flight. So maybe I don't want to make this one. Again, we just created boilerplate, so I'm going to delete that. And instead of flight, I'm going to call it flight policy. And here we go. That looks much better. So delete. We can never delete anything. Update, create, read. We can never do any of these things if we call this can method on the flight. So if we can't read, then we're going to send this response. So I'm going to copy all of this into our different areas that matter, okay? So update, can you update? And then response, we're going to also get response in here. Response. And we would do that again for create. So let's make sure that anybody who has access to this needs to be blocked off. Response, unauthorized, not flight, not, what is it, created? Flight, not updated. All right, so we have these responses that can be sent back for this. And you'll note that we are still redirecting, even though we have the response message set here, except we are aborting whenever this happens. So we are going to have like a 404 or 422, something like that. Depends on the type of unauthorized. I think unauthorized is 422 response code. So whenever you hit a valid response, you have 200 response code on your HTTP request. We're going to abort. So we're not even going to redirect. It's just going to send us some JSON to look at if something's gone wrong, which is fine. We don't need to give fancy design to somebody who's not authorized in this particular tutorial. And that should do it. So we've got our different blocks in place for the authorization. And now we just need to make sure that we tell it how this policy should work. So who can be authorized to do this? So is capable, and this grabs the current user, this auth user, the current authorized user. And then anybody who's an administrator can do these actions. Whoops. So the authorize is for administrators only. Now let's go and register this policy to our auth service. So now that we have the policy in place, we need to tell that auth service to get applied to our flight model. So our flight model needs this flight policy. Okay, and this is how we're going to connect the flight model to that flight policy. Otherwise, it's not really going to know where to look. So here we have our authorization policy in place. Let's jump over to the browser and then see if we can get through since we are logged in as an administrator. And the flight was deleted. Perfect. So that's how those policies work. And one thing that we need to think about here, though, is, what if we want to have a custom capability for this particular policy? Maybe we want it to be, manage flights. So instead of administrator, maybe the current user has to have this custom capability of manage flights. How are we going to get that custom capability applied to an administrator user, for example? And so the easy answer to that is to use TypeRocket to create some custom roles for, or some custom capabilities for our roles. So we'll go roles here, and then we want to add, nope, we want to update roles and capabilities for the administrator, and the capability that we want to add is manage flights. I believe that's correct. Manage flight. We'll call it manage flights. All right, so let's jump over to our functions.php file. And one of the things that this is going to do is it's going to run this code on every page request, but whenever WordPress registers capabilities, it only really needs to do it once, and then you're fine. So you would normally do this bit of code in a plugin activation, or maybe when you run a custom Galaxy CLI command. However, for our use case, we're just going to cheat it and run a single page request to get it into the database, and then we'll comment this out. So we'll refresh the page here. All right, it's been applied. I'm going to comment this out. And then to confirm that it's been applied, I can go to the dev tools of TypeRocket, go to capabilities, and scroll down and make sure that manage flights is in here and it's applied to the administrator. So that looks really good. And with this commented out and our controller in place and our policy ready to go, it should essentially still work the same as it had before because our administrator now has this custom capability. So you might be asking yourself, why should I use these policies over just the standard WordPress version current user can, right? I mean, this is essentially the same thing. And I could even put this code here into my controller. Instead of this, I could put it here. However, what you'll find is as your application scales, if you were to do it this way, you may have extra logic, like current user can do this, or, you know, it's WP debug mode, right? And then you're going to have this in a lot of different locations. So you're like, well, then I can create a function to house this. And when you say you create a function, that's essentially what the policy is. It's just a nice, organized, functional way of kind of containing the different methodologies that you want to have happen under certain circumstances. So you can be a little bit more fancy than the standard current user capability can do something. It gives you the flexibility to kind of handle different scenarios. So let's kind of undo all this. And that's essentially how all this works. However, there is one other thing that we need to do here, even though we have all of these things in place, is if we go to flights here and hit edit, we're mass essentially inserting data into our flight. And what I mean by that is when we submit the form request, as you remember, there's a huge array of data that gets thrown at our create method and our update method. And we're essentially we're trusting every bit of data that comes through that request, and we're saving it to the flight. So technically, maybe that information included, let's say, a field that we didn't include, like the ID. And somebody said, hey, ID of 1, create that. Maybe that's not so safe because now it's going to be potentially deleting our record or replacing something that we didn't want it to. And so the way that we get around this without having to specify each field in an array and pull it out of the request, we can tell the flight model what data is actually trusted to be inserted in bulk onto that model. And we do that with what's called a fillable field. So we can do protected here, fillable, and then we're just going to tell it what fields can be applied in mass to be saved. So we could say notes and meta. And let's say just these are the only two that we're comfortable with saving in mass. Everything else has to be explicitly defined on the model. So what would happen in that case? Let's go back to here, go to flights. Let's edit one of these. And let's try changing the seat ID now. Hit update. Remember, we're 15 at this point, and now we see that it's D1. So we got blocked in terms of being able to update that information when we did a mass edit. And one of the neat things, if you have WordPress debug turned on, is you'll get these little hints. And whenever something is safe for bulk editing, you'll see a little pencil icon that says it's fillable. And we want to turn the rest of these to be fillable as well, not just meta and notes. So we'll jump over to flight here, and we'll do seat ID, customer ID, and now all those fields will be fillable. So that looks great, and we'll refresh the page, change it to 15, hit update, and we'll see that little pin icons everywhere. Now, if we go to the flight section that we had set up earlier, hopefully you kept this, but essentially pull in all this information from our flight of the first record, essentially. And one of the things that we have here is this metadata is just this glob string. And so I was thinking while we were in here kind of messing with these custom properties, I might mention to you a way to clean up the data that gets pulled out from the database. And so that is this method called cast. So if I do meta here, and I tell it to cast it to an array, then whenever the data comes out of the database, like I pull that data out, it's going to cast that metadata into an array. And it's smart enough to know, hey, is this serialized? Is this a JSON scheme kind of information? Then I'm going to know what that is and cast it to an array. And so data that goes in gets formatted. So as data goes in, we're going to take that meta field and encode it to JSON. And when we pull it out, we're going to cast it to an array. And so let's see what that looks like here. And there you go. It's get cast to an array. And then when we JSON encode it for the JSON response, it gets transformed right here into a JSON object, essentially. And so that keeps it from being this kind of nasty glob. And that's really it in terms of setting up this controller outside of the show section. And so I figured, hey, for this show section, we can just take that custom route that we had set up before. And let's just grab this here. And we will plop it into our flight controller onto this section. And we don't need to grab a new one. So we'll just grab flight here. And then you might be wondering, like, can we do a with here to pull in the extra information for this flight? So let's go look at that. Let's go back, flights. If we hit view here for our show page, we'll see that it doesn't really pull in that with information, and that's because we had already queried this. When we use with, it eager loads the data that we're pulling out of the database while we're doing the query. However, if we've already loaded in a resource or a record, instead of with, we can just use this keyword load. And then that will load the information based on what's already there. And there we have all that extra information pulled in. And with that, we've built out our flight system with our custom backend using a custom post type. We've done some really cool policy stuff. We have migrations, and we are all in on this modern workflow. In the next video, we'll take a look at taking what we've built here and pulling it out of a theme and setting it into a custom plugin.